everyone, welcome to our webinar today on the anatomy of a cloud hack. I hope you're all well and have been having a lovely day so far. Yeah, so we'll just wait a minute or so for more attendees to join, and then I'll pass it over to our speakers for the day. Okay, we might as well get started anyway then. So yeah, I would like to pass it over to Roel from the Netherlands. Take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your time all. I hope everybody is well in these uncertain times. I would like to give a special thanks to the Dutch attendees of this webinar. A part of this introduction will also be in Dutch to cater to the Dutch attendees, so please bear with me. My name is Roel Jager. I'm an account manager at Clarinet, and my role is to help look after our customers in the Benelux region. I'm also part of a global team who delivers cybersecurity services, and we provide what we believe world-class ethical hacking and training services. Well, shortly I will be handing you over to Scott Isaac. He is one of our security consultants, and also a black hat trainer and accredited pen tester. Well, and if you don't mind, I would like to tell you a bit about what we do and who we are. Well, we are a specialist in IT security company providing cutting-edge IT security consultancy and training, and we do two main things. Well, we hack and we teach, and of course, when I say hack and teach, there are a few services that fall under this banner. Also, we are part of Clarinet Cybersecurity. We do a variety of services like pen testing, red teaming, training, another few clever things like MDR, continuous security testing, and security consultancy. We have about 20 years of experience in the field. And now I would like to tell you something more about this webinar. Well, cybersecurity as a whole, always it's better to prevent than to cure afterwards. Because once you have been hacked, the future of your whole organization can truly be at risk. And also this training in particular, we have a lot of requests for this, and this is our most popular course. And hopefully this webinar will help you to cut through some of the mysteries of cloud services and to uncover the vulnerabilities that lie beneath. And one more thing, this webinar is an introduction. It's been extracted from our training and courses that originated about 2 years ago. And we, to meet the demand of our customers, there was a number of updates, of course, to keep it fresh and up to date. So now, please allow me to do this introduction in Dutch, and afterwards I'll hand you all over to Scott Isaac. Nou, nogmaals bedankt in het Nederlands. Ik ben Roel Jager. Ik ben een accountmanager bij Clarinet. En tevens dat ik accountmanager ben bij Clarinet, maak ik ook deel uit van het cybersecurity dienst, onze cybersecurity diensten. En ja, wat wij geloven, wij denken echt wel dat wij hele goede training en security diensten aanbieden. Straks zal Scott Isaac jullie meenemen. Dat is een van onze top adviseurs en tevens ook een black hat trainer en pentester ook nog met de juiste papieren. Ik zal je nog een klein beetje mee willen nemen in wat wij nou verder precies doen. Ja, we hacken en we leiden op. Nou, dan zeg ik we hack and we teach in het Engels natuurlijk. In ieder geval een aantal diensten onder. Waaronder pentesten, red teamen. Dat is een combinatie van pentest en bijvoorbeeld fysieke manieren om binnen te komen in een omgeving. Natuurlijk opleidingen en nog een aantal andere slimme dingen zoals MDR, Continuous Security Testing en natuurlijk ook advies. En hierin hebben we ruim 20 jaar ervaring. Nou nog eventjes over dit webinar. Hoe hack je een cloud? Nou, cybersecurity beveiliging, nou ja, dat is natuurlijk wel met meer dingen, maar zeker hier beter voorkomen dan genezen. Als je nou eenmaal bent gehackt, ja, dan kan je er wel een tijdje last van hebben als organisatie. En dat is gewoon echt iets wat je wil voorkomen. Deze training, ja, dat is een van onze meest bezochte en meest populaire cursussen. En ik hoop dat dit webinar je een beetje meeneemt in het verhaal. Wat komt er nou allemaal op je af op cybersecurity gebied. Hoe je dat kan beveiligen in de cloud. En ik hoop dat jullie daar wat wijzer in worden. Wil je er nog even op wijzen? Dit is maar een introductie van de gehele training die wij geven. Het is En we proberen wel die trainingen altijd up-to-date te houden, zodat die wel fris blijft en bij de tijd. En graag geef ik het woord aan Scott om jullie verder mee te nemen. So please, Scott, you can take it over from here.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as you just heard there, this course is very representative of our most popular, one of our most popular courses at the minute, our Hacking and Securing the Cloud course. So a little bit about myself before we get into it. My name's Scotty. I began in electronic warfare, so it's my job to undermine enemy communications. From there, moved to a more strategic space where we were tackling the larger problems of massive kind of intelligence collection. I mentored 2 different capabilities operating out of JSSU Cyprus, and so moving into teaching in the private sector was a natural progression from there. Since then, been working with Not So Secure as a part of Clarinet to deliver training at Black Hat, Nullcon, BrewCon, DEFCON, B-Sides, you name it, I've probably taught there, either advanced infrastructure or cloud security. And during lockdown, I've been keeping myself busy with 3D printing and making horrible Wi-Fi appliances, but they're not the subject of today's talk, so let's get into it. What is cloud? Now, when we begin the course properly, we spend a little bit of time really picking apart some of these misconceptions around cloud, but I'm going to operate on the assumption that you're all fairly familiar with cloud and its benefits. I'll summarize them quickly by saying that it allows us to consume services in a much more economically effective way. If we architect our solutions properly, we will only ever consume when the customer has a demand to make of us. And so we can always be in the black. You know, we're never going to be paying for infrastructure that we're not making money from if we set things up properly. Very flexible, allows us to quickly provision and get rid of resources as we need. Now, all of this sounds great, and in my opinion, working in the cloud, that's the future. That's the way we're going to consume services going forward. But that flexibility is a sword that cuts both ways. If an attacker is able to get into our environment, they can use that same flexibility to quickly establish themselves, not just in one service, but across the entire estate, across the entire subscription. And so we're going to have a look at some of the unique attack surfaces that each of these services offer, how an attacker will make use of them, and what we can do to defend against it in some cases. Now, we need to be aware of our management responsibility when it comes to cloud. Depending on the kind of service that you opt for, be it infrastructure as a service or software as a service, there'll be a division of management responsibility between us and the service provider. Initially, a lot of people assumed that if they just took their existing infrastructure, virtualized it, and stuck it up in the cloud, it would immediately become secure because, you know, AWS or Google or Microsoft are responsible for it. Really not the case. Whilst, you know, they are responsible for this portion, we can still get this section wrong. We can host really bad applications in the cloud just as we can on-prem. We can forget to update and patch our Windows installations in the cloud just as we can on-prem. The difference being is that when these instances are compromised in the cloud, there's usually a more straightforward method for the attacker to go and pivot from one service or one machine into another. So we have to be very well aware of our management responsibility. So as you probably gathered from what I was saying at the beginning about how great cloud is and what an awesome paradigm shift it is, this is why cloud security matters, because there is a massive economic incentive to perform digital transformations that get us cloud native and make the use of those savings to be had. However, if the decision is driven purely with economic benefits in mind and not security benefits or considering re-architecting our solutions, then, you know, we can put really bad applications up in the cloud and it'll end up costing us money as an attacker gets in and subjects us to financial attacks. These new environments have their own complexities and we need to be aware of them. It's not just a simple case of getting rid of some of our management responsibilities. We have to understand how roles and responsibilities work with our user accounts. We have to understand how powerful our root user account is and how we should never be using it. And all of these complexities can lead to misconfigurations that grant an attacker access. Each offering has a unique threat model, and we need to be aware of that. We need to update our thinking from on-prem to the cloud environment. And so one concept to be really mindful of when we think about new complexities is the division between the control plane and the data plane. Now, we'll all be fairly familiar with data plane things if we operate on-prem. Our file servers, our databases, all of those things that we would normally create, they are our data plane assets, and they still exist within the cloud. Although to control those, to create them, update them, maybe even delete them, we would use the control plane to do that. And so a nice analogy when it comes to these two planes and how they interact is that our data plane is like our puppets. They are going to be dancing on stage, controlled by the strings from the control plane. That is our orchestration plane. It allows us to create servers, change them, delete them, and just about anything else. So why do I bring this up? Well, as an attacker, we will typically gain access through some misconfiguration in a data plane asset. And through this misconfiguration, we may be able to access the control plane directly with whatever rights and privileges were assigned to that data plane asset. The minimization of permissions is key when it comes to our data plane assets for this very reason. So as an attacker, which plane are we going to be targeting? Well, typically, we will want to get to the control plane. Cloud is a very dynamic environment and it's changing all the time. So an attacker, when they want to set up persistence, will try and do that in the control plane. But in order to reach that control plane, they'll first need to compromise some data plane asset. And this might be a vulnerable piece of infrastructure, an open or misconfigured bucket, or poor functional logic in a function as a service. So how do we reach this control plane? Through compromising a data plane asset. Well, the control plane itself is accessible internally at the IP address 169.254.169.254, and that is the same across all three major providers. We can also access it through public gateways. We can access it through the command line interface, but to do any of these things, we will need a token or some valid credentials. Now, we may be able to steal a token from a data plane asset like this web server. If we're able to gain code execution or abuse a server-side request forgery vulnerability or something like that, we can extract a token and use that to access the public gateways. Or we may not even need to extract the token. We can simply instruct the server to leverage its own access to perform requests to that control plane and return the response to us. There are lots of different ways of us going about doing this, and we're going to cover a few of them as we go through the course. But first, I'll just forward you to these three links. These will point you to the full documentation for the Metadata API. This is the language that we want to speak when we communicate with the control plane. So you'll find links to all three in this slide. So to return to our previous slide, we're going to be focusing on data plane assets because they are a means to access the control plane. So let's take a look at some unique attack surfaces. And I'm going to just touch on a few here rather than all of the different services in the interest of time. And we're going to begin with infrastructure as a service. The first thing to say here is that we have the most amount of security responsibility of all of the cloud services. We're responsible for making sure the operating system is patched and up to date. The user accounts have robust authentication and monitoring in place, and all of the middleware and runtime that exists is up to date and patched and configured correctly to support our applications, which also have to be secure. So we've got lots to think about in here, lots to get wrong. So from an attacker's perspective, we will be using the same kind of attack surface that we would typically have on-premise. Out-of-date operating systems, poor user authentication, lack of software patching leading to vulnerability. The key difference here is that after we've compromised one of those traditional vulnerabilities, we may now have access to an authentication token that will allow us to talk to the control plane, and that's our primary goal. To compare that with function as a service, we have a greatly reduced level of responsibility. Now, a function as a service is essentially a block of code written in your language of choice, and it is executed when a condition is met. And that condition can be something inside your subscription or a condition outside of your subscription. For example, somebody has sent an HTTP request to that function, it's run and it's answered it. Now, these functions are highly ephemeral. They will run for about 3 seconds in general, and then they will destroy themselves. They can be configured to run for a longer duration, but you have to go out of your way to do that. So 3 seconds is normal. From an attacker's perspective, these can seem not very useful. They only run for 3 seconds, so how much can I get done in that time? Well, really, quite a bit, depending on the vulnerability. We can use these functions as a conduit through which to access the control plane or to steal tokens that that function has, which allows it to do its job. Now, there's a nice serverless top 10, which we've linked to at the bottom of this slide if you want to go into more detail. And then finally, software as a service. Massively reduced responsibility now. We primarily have to make sure that we get identity and access management right, and also all things client-side. When it comes to data in transit and at rest, really, we're talking here about regulation and compliance, moving that maybe personal data through regions which we're allowed to based on the regulation that applies to us. So really, we'll be focusing on all things client-side. Our traditional phishing scams are a great way to get around this, and also abusing any identities that we're able to find within the subscription. And we're going to look at how we can enumerate those in a little video demo shortly. So we'll begin with reconnaissance, as we must. We can't begin to attack our adversary until we know what they've got. So yeah, time spent on reconnaissance is seldom wasted. I believe that was the Duke of Wellington, and something that got drilled into me in my previous life in the military. Yeah, apologize for this bouncy toolbar, by the way. Not sure why it started doing that. Anyway, we like to break down cloud service enumeration into 2 main camps: asset enumeration and credential hunting. Asset enumeration is concerned with finding out what our target has. Gone are the days when we could just identify some network ranges that belong to our target, scan them, enumerate them, and move on from there. Now the net blocks are owned by third-party service providers like Google and Amazon and Microsoft, so we can't just scan those blocks. I mean, that's not strictly true. You can scan them. If you use tools like Zmap, you may be able to get through them quicker than you thought. That's Zmap, not Nmap, a very quick network scanner. But we can use subdomain enumeration to determine subdomains which belong to our target. We can take our target's primary domain and then attach words to the beginning of that domain and see if they exist. Common words like VPN, OWA, for example. We can also use OSINT. We can use search engine like Google, Bing, and also search engines like Shodan. Shodan isn't a typical search engine. It's used to find infrastructure and not web pages. You can search Shodan for open ports or servers that have a particular banner or string in them. So we can use strings which are related to our target. Now, Bing, it's arguably not the most popular search engine out there, but it does have some unique features, such as being able to search for results that come from specific network ranges. That's a nice feature, but also it's just a good habit to use a range of different search engines so that you don't get tunnel blindness in just one search engine. We can also use certificate transparency logs to identify subdomains related to our target. When it comes to credential hunting, we want to determine 2 things: usernames and passwords. These passwords may take the form of access tokens that have been accidentally disclosed to code repositories like GitHub or Bitbucket, and our usernames we may be able to guess or gather through OSINT. sources like LinkedIn, and using metadata gathered from documents, we can determine the username schema in use. Now, DNS is going to be really useful for us. Of course, MX records will point to our mail server, but in a cloud context, this would reveal the consumption of some cloud email service. The same applies to NS records, except for DNS providers. Text records are the most useful since they're typically used for domain validation. We'll insert a text record that has a unique string in it, and that will prove to some cloud vendor that we are authoritative over that domain, and we can use it in that cloud service. SPF records are a form of text record which authorize certain entities to send and receive email on our behalf. Google hacking. We're not hacking Google itself. We are using advanced search operators within Google to get very specific pieces of information. We can limit our results to a particular site using the site operator. And this can be a great way of bringing back subdomains. But in this example, we're using it to find buckets. We're searching for the string we know that is associated with buckets, storage buckets, and we're combining this search with a string related to our target. This could be the business name or some product or service that that business offers. We can also search the following URL to determine whether or not our target has static websites hosted in that bucket. So the certificate transparency log then. For all websites that have a X509 certificate issued to them, that is, they are secure using SSL or TLS, we can search for those certificates. We simply enter the domain name of our target, and it will return any subdomains that have certificates registered to that subject. Very quick way of finding new subdomains, provided that that subdomain is host to a secure website. This is not going to find things like databases or other services that don't have a registered certificate attached to them. So username and secret enumeration. First of all, we want to determine the username schema. For example, my username might be something like SIsaac or Isaac S. We can determine this schema through the metadata in documents. Office documents are fantastic for this, since if they're authored internally, the user's username may be stored in the document as metadata, as the author, the last person to modify that document, or the owner. And together with our Google hacking, we can quickly find those documents and extract metadata using tools like EXIF tool. Once we have these usernames, we can throw them at some of these cloud vendor APIs. We're going to have a look at an example of one cloud vendor API being used to enumerate usernames. Once we've got our usernames, we want to determine what their password is. Now, in the full course, we go into quite a lot of detail on the default complexity rules for all three vendors and what we can do about that. But here, we're just going to talk about our two primary options, and that is password brute forcing, where account lockout isn't applicable, and password spraying, where we can only have one attempt per username, but we're going to make that a really good attempt. We'll put into that a lot of work to uncover breaches attached to that user in the hope that they've reused that password internally. So we're going to have a look now at Enumeration Demo. That is not good. I'm going to quickly grab this from my drive. Bear with me 1 second. So as you can see, I've been signed out. Google likes to do this to me. And for security reasons, I don't like to have this computer remembered. But it's always the worst time it chooses to do it. And here we see a good example of the trade-off between functionality, usability, and security. Okay, there we go. Quick recovery there. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so here I've broken down my terminal into two panes. I'm going to be working in the top one, and my results will be saved at the bottom. And the bottom is going to be a list of targets that I've discovered. Here we can see that I'm just using dig to find a list. Well, first of all, find the name server attached to my target. My target in this case is victim.cloud, and I want to know the name server that's responsible for this domain. And I've got DNS 1 and 2, both over at registrarservices.com. If this were with some cloud provider, I know I can start focusing my efforts there, but at the minute, this is just a generic hosting provider. The MX record backs this up too, both obfuscated over at registrarservices.com. The A record points to 4 different addresses in the same range, and we can see who owns those just by running a quick whois lookup. And we can see here that that points to GitHub. So our target is using GitHub pages to host their site. It might be in another situation that that NetBlock is owned by AWS. And so we know now our target is consuming those AWS services. You can see here, I'm just drawing attention to this MS text record. This MS text record indicates that our target may be using Azure services, Azure Active Directory identity services. This is something we'll confirm later on, but it's good to know at this point so that we can do some further investigation. You can also see some other domain verification here, just to give you an idea of the kind of records you might see. We've also got an SPF record, which shows here that our target is consuming Outlook email protection services. This now gives us some more information about how we want to approach this target. But as yet, I've got no new targets. So let's see what we can do about that. I'm going to take an automated approach to DNS enumeration now. I'm going to use DNS scan. We simply give it a name server to use. We're going to use CloudFront's caching DNS server here and point it to our target. We're also going to give it a word list, and this word list contains potential subdomains, which it's now iterating through. So we've got one new target, db.victim.cloud. I'm going to add that along with the original target to our targets file. You can see victim.cloud, the naked domain, and www.victim.cloud. They're both the same IP addresses. But we'll also get db.victim.cloud in there as well. Cool, so 3 targets so far. Let's have a look at the certificate transparency log for this target. These are all the SSL and TLS certificates issued for subdomains of victim.cloud. You can see we've got vOffice, Incognito, Azure Function, AWS Lambda, and there are things sat behind all of these. We have quite a rich set of targets for our cloud hacking course, and there are many more that you don't see. So we've got a few there from that page. Rather than copy and pasting them individually, I'm going to use curl to perform the same query, and I'm going to format the output so that it fits nicely in my targets file. I'm going to use a regular expression to lift those values out. We're essentially looking for any string that ends with the word victim.cloud. We're going to unique the results because there were lots of duplicates on that page. And now we're going to forward all of those lines into our targets file. So I'll run the same command again and forward the output into targets.txt. Awesome. Our list of targets is now growing. We need to determine who owns these, as in which cloud provider. Earlier on, we used whois to determine the domain of the victim.cloud site. The owner of the IP block for the victim.cloud site. Now that took a little bit of time to do. We had to run a whois lookup. We're going to do that for all of these records now in targets.txt with this nasty little bash one-liner. We're going to run dig to determine the A record for each domain, and then we're going to use that A record or the IP address in a whois lookup. And that's very quickly gone off and fetched those results. We can see the Azure function is owned by Microsoft, no surprise there. The domain and the dub and naked domain, they're both owned by GitHub. The office owned by AWS. So we covered quite a bit of information now just from DNS alone. We're going to take a look now at the Azure text record we found. We found a text record that indicated our target was using Azure Active Directory. And so I'm going to send a request here to login.microsoftonline.com get user realm to determine whether or not this domain is managed in AAD. Now this command that I'm running here, microsoftonline.com is only going to look at everything following the @ symbol. So I can type anything I want here. I don't need to have done username enumeration yet. This could be ASDF or anything else that you want to type on the keyboard. What's being evaluated is victim.cloud, and Microsoft is going to tell me whether or not it is managed. I've used grep to highlight this section just for presentation purposes, and I can see that it is managed. We're now going to generate a username list. Now, in reality, you would do really good open source intelligence to determine the names of real people who worked at this organization, but in the interest of time, we're going to use a list of popular names. We're going to take 30 of them using this command, and we're going to save this as our popular names list. Now that we've got this name list, we're going to give it to a script that we've put together called enum Azure AD users. We'll give it the target domain and the username list. And it's going to contact that Azure API and tell us which of these usernames exist. We can see that Bob exists, and so does Kevin and Alice. So we've got 3 usernames now we can begin to look at in more detail with our password attacks later on. So we've got some domains there and also a few usernames. This could be the thin end of the wedge for a much more serious compromise. And so when it comes to compromise, I'm going to give another little quote. This one is, "There is pleasure in stealing the souls of machines." There certainly is. It is fun to break into machines. And that's what we're going to be doing in this next section, using some of the information that we've just found. The quote here is from the Book of Cataclysm from the game Syndicate Wars, if you ever played that. And so from the attacker's perspective, when we see a web server or a database, it's going to behave just the same way as any other website or database. Things become more interesting once we compromise that server and we're able to explore the resources that it has access to. Let's say, for example, we have a web server that can query the RDS service within AWS. For that web server to be able to do that, we will have needed to have granted it a role. That role has privileges within RDS. So if we can compromise the web server, we'll be able to inherit those privileges within the RDS service. If that server has been set up with root privileges, then we could completely destroy that business or set up a crypto mining operation or anything else that we wanted to do. And in the Hacking and Securing the Cloud course, we look at some really horrendous case studies of people that have really had their whole business deleted through that kind of exploit. So let's look at a few different ways in which services can be hosted. Functions are great for hosting microservices, a single block of code that can respond to an event. And in our case, we're going to have that event be an HTTP request. So a user sends an HTTP request, the function will lift some values out of it, process, enrich, and return the result back to the user. Now, the OWASP have created a top 10 of threats related specifically to function as a service. It's an interpretation of the normal OWASP top 10, but for functions, and it's well worth checking out. the too long didn't read for that is file read vulnerabilities are going to be really useful to us. That will let us read environment variables, which can have sensitive tokens in them. Things like directory traversal and XML external entity attacks. Remote code execution is, of course, as good as it gets. We can read environment variables, send curl requests, do whatever we want. And server-side request forgery, a way of tricking that function into sending a request to a location that it shouldn't be sending requests to. And here's an example of that SSRF. Let's say we've got an application that checks whether or not a website is up and running. It accepts from us a URL, and it takes that URL and it sends a web request to it. Now that's all very well and good, but if the service isn't checking where that URL points, we may be able to pass it a URL in a location like this. We can't access that URL directly, but this web server can. This is the address to the control plane, the metadata API. It's going to then send that request and return the response back to us. That is the essence of server-side request forgery. Now, path traversal, being able to read files from this function. Within AWS, we can't use functions to access the metadata API directly. AWS doesn't expose the metadata API to functions. However, it does give that function a set of tokens that it can use to access services. We can steal those tokens from the environment variables if we can read them. Now, GCP does allow access to the metadata API. However, it requires the inclusion of headers when you send a request. This prevents us from performing SSRF, since that kind of vulnerability doesn't give us any way of defining headers. Now, it used to be the case until very recently, just the last Black Hat, that you could use v1 beta 1 to access the metadata API without headers. v1 beta 1 is an older version of the metadata API, and it was quite insecure. It was originally scheduled for depreciation back in 2019, the first time, December 2019. They then pushed that date forward to September 2020, and it was still live. We could still access it from our vulnerable applications. So we left it in the course. However, that has now gone. You will be lucky to be able to access this anywhere. Now, Azure doesn't expose creds in the environment, and it also doesn't allow access to the metadata API. However, you may have access to a storage bucket inside which tokens could be stored. That is how you allow access to tokens for your functions within Azure. Now, if we can read files through these vulnerabilities, we would want to read the contents of proc self environ. That contains the environment variables for that function. Now, code execution, it's as good as it gets. The requirement to include headers in requests can be satisfied through RCE. We can call a program like curl, and we can tell curl, use these headers when you contact the metadata API. So we can also use this to read the contents of files, execute code. It's as good as it gets. There are no restrictions in our way from the vendor if we achieve RCE. We'll only be limited by the identity and access management role that was assigned to that function. So we're going to have a look at abusing function as a service now, and I'm going to talk us through this video demo. Now, we discovered this one function in our enumeration. Just now, we found this function called AWS lambda.victim.cloud, and we found it through the certificate transparency log. Now, this function seems to work like a proxy. We can give it a web address, and it will go and fetch that web address and return the contents of the page to us. Here, I pointed it to the not so secure main page. Let's point it somewhere else. I'm going to point it to api.ipify.org. This is a very simple API. It just tells you your IP address, but this isn't going to be my IP address at home. This will be the IP address of the function. So I can do a whois lookup of this and see who owns it. So it's Amazon. I know straight away that I can't access the metadata API. It's not exposed to functions within AWS. And just to prove this, I'll give it a go. We'll enter the address for the metadata API, followed by the path, which would normally give us some security credentials. Connection refused. We're unable to access this address. That's normal, and that is expected for functions within AWS. Let's see instead if we can use this vulnerability to read files instead. And we can. I've just looked at the contents of etc passwd, and it's listed all of the users of this system. But what we want to view are the environment variables, and the path for that is proc self environ. And we can see them listed out here. We've got our session token, we've got our access key, our secret access key, everything that we would need to access this victim subscription as the function. So we will inherit any rights and privileges that this function has within the subscription. To get these into the AWS command line, we're going to perform the same request from the command line using curl. So this is just the same address that we entered into the browser, but we'll see the output in the terminal instead. Nice. We've got all of our environment variables, but they're all separated by these Unicode null characters. We're going to need to tidy this up before we can use it. So I'm going to perform the same request again, but I'm going to pipe it into a program called sed, which will format this text into a way that I can use it. I'm going to replace those values with a new line so that each environment variable appears on its own line. Here we can see sed in action there. Look for these and replace it with these. It's that simple. And I'm using grep to highlight a few of these values for presentation purposes. Now, for me to use these, I need to set them as my own environment variables, and the AWS command line will find and use them. So one last time, we're going to run this same command again, except I'm going to run it inside of a for loop. So what I'm telling the system here is that for each line that comes back from the previous command, I want you to set it as an environment variable using the export command. And I can check that those have been set by echoing one of them out. So let's see what we can access using these tokens. But before we do that, let's take a look at a function within GCP. Unfortunately, this is in the good old days of V1 Beta 1. Remember, that's the version of the metadata API that doesn't require headers. So it's kind of more of a history lesson, this, because the vulnerability doesn't tend to exist that much anymore. We're going through the same process, though. We're determining where this function is hosted. We're going to use whois to do that. Even though the domain name itself is fairly obvious, it's nice to show the process. One thing to be wary of with whois records is that they all spell organization differently. Uppercase O, lowercase o, Z or S, or maybe just org. So we're going to run that command again. From the command line, see if we can get a token. And this should fail because Google requires the use of this header. But that's only in version 1 of the metadata API. If V1 Beta 1 is available, we'd be able to send that same request without a header and it will work. So let's test to see if that's the case. Now, it does seem to be a phased rollout of or a rollback of V1 Beta 1, so it is always worth checking. You never know, you might get lucky, but as far as we can tell, it doesn't seem to work on infrastructure or functions any longer. You may still find it somewhere though. We can see that V1 Beta 1 is available here, and we can follow this path down through instance and service accounts And we can choose either default or this specific service account. There's no way I'm going to try and type that out. We'll paste it in. And then /token to get our OAuth token. We can pass that to the GCP command line tool to then be authenticated as this function. Like I say, you'll be lucky to find V1 Beta 1 available, but there doesn't seem to be a hard stop to it. It was rolled back slowly. You may still find it somewhere. I'll save that as a text file for later on. And then finally, Azure. Now, thinking back to our function slide on Azure, we know that the metadata API isn't exposed to functions, and it doesn't provide tokens as environment variables either. That function may have access to a bucket that gives it those tokens, but that is all. So we'll go through that same process. We'll determine where this is hosted first of all, using the API epify.com, or org rather, request. We'll drop that into whois, and that will tell us who owns that net block. Unsurprisingly, it's Microsoft. The domain gives it away. But let's go through that same process and take this address and drop it into the command line, see if we can get some values out of it. First thing we'll do, send a request to the metadata API just to prove that you cannot access it from a function. No response. So just as we did before, let's see if we can use this vulnerability to read files from the function instead. And I'm going to point the file, or I'm going to point that parameter to the win_ini file, see if we can read that. And we can. So we'll be able to read some limited files that this function has access to, but little more than that. So let's take a look at Azure Active Directory then. Azure Active Directory allows you to extend the control of your on-prem Active Directory into the cloud. I think the most powerful thing about AAD is that it allows you to have that centralized control and single source of truth in on-prem Active Directory, and that extends its influence into the cloud. So once upon a time, you may delete a user from Active Directory when they leave the company, but there may be all these other accounts that are tied up in cloud environments that we just couldn't reach or control. Now, through an AD Connect server, we can synchronize our on-prem identities with Azure Active Directory. And this allows us to control access to cloud applications like Office 365, Google Docs, Dropbox. We can also use external identity providers and authorize our own business applications through OAuth using Azure Active Directory. So when we're thinking about breaking in as one of these users, we have to consider password complexity. It has 3 rules by default. Simple is just a password which is 8 characters long. And then there's strong, and this is the setting by default. Any 3 of the following conditions: lowercase characters, uppercase, numbers, and symbols. If you've got any 3 of those, that will be allowed, provided it's at least 8 characters. But there's one other caveat to this. Azure does quite a nice thing, which is to check your password to make sure it's not terrible. For example, I just bring up my notepad here. If I were to enter a password like this onto Azure Active Directory, that would satisfy the rules. Uppercase P, we've got symbols, we've got lowercase, we've got numbers. Brilliant, it's a good password, but I mean, pretty easy to guess. And Azure thinks so too. If you enter a password like that, they'll block it. They won't allow you to have things like summer 20 or 21. And that's a good thing, good for security, but it does make our lives more difficult. And then there's custom. You need a premium subscription to be able to use this, and you could set whatever rules you want. We also need to bear in mind the lockout. Now, by default, that is going to be a 1-minute lockout after 10 incorrect attempts. However, if our target is synchronizing through an AD Connect server, then AAD may inherit the on-prem lockout conditions. And on-prem, that is normally 3 attempts and you're locked out. So we have to bear that in mind, and we have to do good reconnaissance to determine whether or not our target is synchronizing identities to AAD before we begin password attacks. So to increase our chances of success, good OSINT, of course, determining related breaches for our users that we've enumerated, but also targeted word lists. And we can gather words from a page, like somebody's social media profile or maybe their LinkedIn profile, and we can add complexity to those rules by using cool to gather the words and RS Mangler to add complexity. We can also use John the Ripper to add complexity to word lists. Rather than just cracking hashes with John the Ripper, we could say, give it a word from the pipe in the terminal, or for the standard input in the terminal. Tell it that we're accepting input from the pipe. We'll apply this core logic mutation rule set and print those words back into the terminal where we can save them into a text file. Once we've authenticated as a user, we then want to perform authenticated enumeration. No matter how lowly privileged our user is that we've compromised, they will always be able to tell us the name of every other user in that subscription or in that Active Directory. And we can list this out from the command line just by running azad user list. The rest of the command is not necessary. We're just running a filter. We're asking for some the following values: the user principal name, display name, email address, and so on. From my perspective, the user principal name is the most valuable thing. We're going to be able to use this in lots of other attacks later on. So that's the main thing you want to save. We can also look at service principals. These service principals will be granted a level of access within the subscription, and they also cannot change their password because they're service accounts. They're not going to be forced to update their password regularly, normally. So we want to know about service principals that our target has created. Now, they've got some manual commands that we just looked at there for gaining information, but we can take an automated approach as well. PowerShore is an absolutely fantastic tool. I could talk about it all day. It automates lots of not just reconnaissance, but also offensive actions as well, and data exfiltration. Really powerful tool. We don't demo it here because it's a PowerShell script and we just run things in our attacker environment. But Road Recon is an excellent tool as well for gathering information and building a picture of just what services and resources exist and what level of access your account or other accounts may have to them. So we're going to have a look at an Azure AD compromise now and information gathering using Road Recon. So we've got our user list that we created earlier on. We determined that Alice, Bob, and Kevin were all valid users. So we're going to try and password spray these users now. And to do this, we need a password that we have high confidence in. Season 20 is not just a random password I plucked out of the air. There is a trail of evidence that leads us to this, and it's by compromising a SaaS link for an Azure storage account. We build up to this in the course. We don't just pluck it out of the air. But we found there that through that password spraying attack that Bob's password is season 20. That's who that password belonged to. We can now authenticate using the command line. We're now authenticated as Bob, and we want to list out all of the other users that exist within this subscription. Now we've got tons of information here, lots of stuff we don't really need, like the path to somebody's profile picture. Who cares? The thing that I'm looking for here is the user principal name. That's going to enable me to do lots of other things later on. So I'm going to extract those using quite a hacky grep command together with cut. Now, really, I should have just used JQ for this, but hey ho. We're going to use cut. We're going to use the double quote as a delimiter, and we'll extract field number 4, which is the user principal name. And there it is. Now that we've got it, we've just saved it into this targeted user list text file. And we can use that to perform other kinds of enumeration, like listing out group memberships. Now, I'm going to iterate through this text file, and for each username in it, I'm going to list out all of the groups that account is a member of. And that's just going to give me a very quick impression of which accounts have which particular roles and which ones I'm going to want to target later on down the line. So 2 accounts really stand out to me there. There's the Key Vault admin, it's a member of a group called Secret Managers, and also the Azure audit account, a member of the auditors group. Now those are custom groups. We don't know what permissions are attached to them. We can run road recon though to make the process of discovery much more simple. We first need to authenticate and then use road recon to gather information from the Azure Graph API. It's very quick. And now that it's gathered that information, we can have a look at the report running road recon GUI. And all it's doing here is spinning up a simple web server and attaching us to this database of results that it's found. So let's visit that local web server. And here's our report to give us the federated name for our target organization. Here's our users. This is all information we knew already, but now we can have a look at when that user last changed their password and whether or not the account is active. We can take a look at groups and we can click into those group names and get more specific information about the privileges attached to them. We can also have a look at roles that have been established and the permissions that have been attached to those, and also applications that the organization has authorized. The nice thing about looking here is that we would not have discovered these through certificate transparency logs or DNS brute forcing, because these point to entirely different domains. But we now know that these are connected to our target. We can broaden the scope of our attack. So we've got our foothold, we've got Bob's account, but using Bob's account, we were able to extract all of the other users that exist. On the off chance that Bob is responsible for 2 different accounts, or that password was reused somewhere else, we're now going to password spray against all users. And as it happens, Bob is also responsible for the Key Vault admin account. So we can authenticate using that account now and begin to leverage its access in the environment, if we so choose. And that's now escalated us vertically up to the Key Vault admin. But what is the Key Vault? It's a protected secret storage used for cryptographic information, tokens, keys, you name it. And in order to identify these secrets, we can attach tags to them. In this case, someone has attached the tag address, and the value is victim.database.windows.net. We'll have to investigate this and find out just what it is. But for now, we're going to leverage this user's access to extract secrets from the Key Vault. Now that we have the ID of this Key Vault, we can request secrets from it. So I'm going to run the AZ Key Vault command again, and this time I'll run secret show, providing the ID that I've just highlighted there. And if I have the correct permissions, I'll be able to view that secret. Now, the Key Vault is highly protected storage. You would need some quite specific access in order to view secrets. And even then, you'll likely only be able to view those secrets that have been assigned to you or to the server that you've compromised. We've run that secret show command and we seem to have a password. DEA9WIEX%E. We're going to have to use that information to determine just how to attack this box. Victim.database.windows.net. It was referenced in the address tag of that secret. A quick scan reveals that it is definitely a database, and almost every port is returning some kind of response. But databases hosted over at database.windows.net are hosted SQL instances. They are MS SQL hosted instances. Access can be provided in one of two ways, either locally inside of the database or through IAM roles and user accounts. But that is a lesson for another day. That's as far as we're going to take Azure AD. Very quickly then, we're going to take a look at cloud storage. Another quote from the Book of Cataclysm: all knowledge is stored somewhere, be it in books, heads, or deep under glaciers, and when we find it, we make it ours. Can be quite straightforward when it comes to cloud storage, since misconfiguration is very common. All three providers have their own version of object storage. And it's important to stress that these are objects. They are completely agnostic to the file system. That kind of storage would be block storage. Here, we upload an object, we can attach metadata to it, and we get a unique ID for that object. We don't need to care or know about any disks that it sits on. And it provides extremely high uptime. Now, access is commonly set in three modes. Anonymous access, or completely open, that allows anyone anywhere to access that storage, and that's fine for some use cases. Authenticated access is slightly misleading, since it gives the impression that you need to be authenticated within the subscription to gain access to it. That's what I would think reading this, but in fact, you only need to be authenticated with any subscription. So let's say you have a bucket set up with authenticated access, and I try to access it. I get knocked back. I can't authenticate with your subscription, so I authenticate with my own. I just log into my own EC2 control panel. I now have access to your bucket simply because I am authenticated somewhere. Really horrendous, and a lot of people misconfigure their storage in this way. Finally, restricted to specific ID, this is what authenticated access should do, and you have to list a specific account to grant access to. So when we attack cloud storage, we want to focus on the permissions that have been set and the IAM user accounts that have access. If anonymous access is granted on that bucket, fantastic. We still need to list the contents though, and being able to list the contents of a bucket is a separate permission. If you've got both of those, you're cooking with gas. You can rip off everything that appears in that storage. Misconfigured write access for a resource. Cloud storage is billed by usage, as with a lot of things in cloud. If you have write access, you could cost the owner of that subscription quite a lot of money by uploading thousands of files very quickly. Or you could leave something in that storage that would be trusted by the legitimate users of that storage. Let's say you've got a kind of Dropbox setup almost, which is relying on AWS S3. If we can write a file there and somebody logs into that Dropbox, they may think this is a legitimate document left here by one of my colleagues, when in fact it's full of malware. Restricted to authenticated user, we can get around that by authenticating in our own account, and we can abuse improper IAM rules and policies to gain access to that data. How do we discover these buckets? Well, earlier on in the course, when we looked at Google hacking, we looked at some URLs which are associated with S3 storage and object storage. But we can use these automated tools to guess the names of storage if we give it a keyword. We could give it the name of our target or even the name of some product or service that they offer. It will take that word, mutate it, add other words to it, and look it up as a bucket. Now, Azure Storage is a bit of a different beast because you don't just have the bucket name, but you also have a container name within it. The other thing that makes it interesting is that we can provide parameters to that bucket when we try and access it. Res type is short for resource type, container, and comp allows us to list the contents. Now, if permissions have been set up in an insecure way, we may be able to just browse the contents of that container and even escalate outside of it. The other thing that makes Azure storage more interesting than the others is that you can set up these assigned URLs. And these are a great way of providing access to your storage account without creating a new user account. So in a lot of ways, these URLs are more secure than the traditional way of granting access to a resource. These can't be abused to gain access to other resources within the cloud, only storage. However, these are commonly misconfigured, and if you find one of these, there are a couple of parameters that you want to check before anything else. The first one is SRT, and this is which resources we have access to using this link. S, storage account, C, container, O, object. If you have all three, this is a very powerful link. The next is SP, and this lists the permissions that we have across these things. Read, write, delist, delist, that's a new word. Read, write, delete, list, add, I always forget the others, but we've got a nice table that lists them all on the course itself. We're going to have a look at abusing one of these URLs now and enumerate some cloud storage. So here's one I made earlier. This is a run through of CloudEnum, and all we did was give it the keyword victim. And off the back of that, it's found victim s3, aws.com. And because it's open, it's listed the files in there as well. Victim build. And you can see the way it's taking our keyword and it's adding words onto the end and onto the beginning. So build is a common word you might find in buckets. Now this victim public, this belongs to us, and it's intentionally vulnerable so that people can hack it on our course. We've also found some Azure buckets as well. Victim assets is another one of our storage accounts. And also we've got an open container here, which we may be able to abuse shortly. And because it's open, it's listed the files contained within. Now you can see this enumeration tool doesn't just check for storage, it checks for all different kinds of cloud resources like hosted websites, databases, and it's found a couple of other resources here as well. It's also checked Google storage. Victim private and public are both ours, deliberately vulnerable and open for the course. And victimdb.appspot is not one of ours, so I can't give you permission to hack it. So now that we've found those, we're going to take a look at, I believe we've got Azure coming up now. No, we're going to take a look at those buckets that we've enumerated. And we can just do that from the command line, although the command line will want us to authenticate. You can use your own account to do this, but we compromised a function earlier on in the course, so let's use its credentials to gain access. We sent a request to that function, stole the tokens, and now we can enumerate that bucket. We can copy files down just by running AWS S3CP and copying the file to a location that we want. Now we are running slightly over here, so I'm going to skip through this just a little bit and give you the chance to ask questions at the end. I think the really interesting thing in this section is our Azure signed URL. This section we just cover using the legitimate command line tools to enumerate and gain access to those buckets that we've just discovered. Okay, so we're getting into our signed URL now. So I've used a program here called Cloud Scraper, and I've pointed this at our target domain. It's gone through the source code of that main page and it's looked for any URLs that point to any kind of cloud service whatsoever, and it's found that SaaS URL. Remember, we want to check the SRT and SP parameter. SRT here, SCO, very powerful, and SP, read, list, and execute. So we can steal files at least, but we can't write. So I've copied that URL and I'm now going to visit it in my browser. So this is the main page for our victim. And if we have a look in the source code, we can see where Cloud Scraper got that URL from. And it was used in an image tag. So the victim logo on this site was actually pointed to by a SaaS URL. And you can see that URL up in the address bar now, along with the SRT parameters. So remembering back, we can use the res type comp to point this URL at the resource type container. So we're going to delete the file itself, and instead we're going to replace that with the resource type container parameter and comp list. So now we're telling Azure to list the contents of the asset folder. And unfortunately, there's only one file in there. It's just this logo. But because the SRT parameter gives us access to the entire storage account, we can hop up one directory. And we can see that there are two directories here, assets and secret. Let's modify the URL to go into the secret directory. Inside of here, we've just got one file again. And this is super secret notes. So we can get rid of the res type container and comp list parameters and try and access that file. And there we go, we've got a single document that just contains a password. And that's where we got the password from earlier on. So that was a lot of information, I think, to squeeze into the time that we had. I hope you found it informative. If you do want to learn more or go over a lot of this content and more over a 2 and now 3 day period, check out our hacking course, our cloud hacking course. We look at automated container vulnerability investigation, containers as a service. We look at pivoting attacks through Azure, AWS, and GCP. We abuse identity services like Cognito, snapshot forensics, and lots of other stuff as well, including 2 new capture the flag events where you get to test what you've learned in a unguided session, although we will be there to hold your hand if you need us to. So yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over now. I will be available at the end if you've got any questions, but thank you all very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much for that, Scott. That was a really interesting, informative presentation there. I do apologise, some of you are staying on a bit later, we have run over. However, if you would like to stay on, we've got a few more bits to say, and we'd be grateful for that. So yeah, regarding our training courses, these are the 2 upcoming training courses regarding cloud. We will be sharing these slides with you so you can access the courses for the following links below. If you do enter the code below as well, you'll be able to receive a 20% discount for the courses above. So, you know, make sure to go check them out on our website. We do have more information there for you. Also, yeah, we do again have more upcoming training courses here related to web infrastructure hacking, DevSecOps, AppSec for developers. So please feel free to email training@notsosecure.com just to make sure that you get your place on them if you're interested. Again, there is a lot more detail on our website if you would like to look at these courses and what they entail. Additionally, yeah, we are running 2 new exclusive webinars on cloud, specifically, as you can see, the ones highlighted in red. We're happy to announce these, so please make sure that you sign up to them. We will be sending out some emails and some social communications over the coming weeks to sign up. Yeah, these webinars are really useful just to kind of get a taster into the full training courses that we offer. So again, specifically the cloud ones for hacking and securing cloud infrastructure. And yes, this webinar links to the Hacking and Securing Cloud Infrastructure 2-day training course, and specifically we are offering a prize draw where you can win a free place on the next live remote delivery for this session. So by speaking to one of our team about the training or any of your pen test requirements, please contact Not So Secure on the email below, and we can provide further information for you on how to enter. So yeah, just send us an email, we'll provide all the information there for you too, but it's something exclusive to these webinars, so really I would take up that offer. But yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to just quickly pass over to Roel again, just so that he can say a few words, and then we'll go into the Q&A session. So please feel free to ask any questions in the question bar below. So yeah, I'll just pass over to you now, Roel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. As said, if you find this of any of interest, please check our website for a whole lot of other courses and training dates. And please know that we really specialize in running these courses also at large conferences, via partners, in-house training, and we can run them directly for your organization, either remotely or on your premises. And also we do also provide a lot more security-minded activities, and our consultants love to work with you in the future. So real quick in Dutch. Dank je allemaal voor jullie aandacht. Ik hoop dat jullie het interessant hebben gevonden. En ik wil jullie nog even erop attenderen dat wij naast deze trainingen, die we ook bij jullie op locatie zouden kunnen verzorgen, dat we ook nog hele andere cybersecurity diensten aanbieden. En we willen graag in de toekomst samen met jullie werken. So please, let's take it over to the Q&A.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Roel. And again, like to reiterate, thank you, Scott. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, Scott, so I'm just going to ask them to you now. Some of them are a bit longer, so yeah, just
yeah, okay, no problem.
We'll ask them, which is great. So one of the questions that we've had in is, I'm learning a lot about these attack vectors and they're super exciting, but how does one enumerate such functions exposed on the internet? Apart from subdomain enumeration and stumbling along a similar one, is there any other way too?
So yeah, so if you think back to the first AWS one that we looked at, yeah, you're right. There's no way for us to have just guessed that we would give it the we would ask for the proxy application. Sure, we were able to enumerate AWS lambda.victim.cloud through subdomain, but then yeah, you're right. How would you find the proxy part of it? Well, a few ways you could approach it would be through tools like Dirbuster. Dirbuster is a URL brute forcing application. It throws words at an application and tries to find those applications within it and those paths. But also, if that URL is referenced by another application that you might have found, let's say through OSINT that you found a GitHub page related to your target and there are pointers in there to this function, there may be indicators as to how that function is being used. But unfortunately, there's no real comprehensive way that you can do it like you would, a network scan. If you scan a subnet, you know what's up and you know what's not. You can't really do that for a function. You have to be a bit clever, I'm afraid. There's no easy way, but Dirbuster and examining other information disclosures on code repositories is a good place to start.
Great, thank you for that. And another question that we've had in too is, I think it's regarding one of the demos that you showed. If the Azure ad protection password is enabled, what is the release time default, or is there any other method for finding the release time of a locked account? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so unfortunately, you would need to be authenticated to look at things like password lockout policies. It might be though that if it is synchronized through on-prem, you can discover this by compromising that on-prem environment, and you can look up lockout policies with a very lowly privileged account. But if you're dealing exclusively with a standalone AAD environment, you would need that foothold to determine, or you would have to essentially push an account to the point of it being locked, and monitor it to determine how long till it comes back up. Things like multi-factor authentication, you can enumerate. When you perform things like password spraying, you get a different error response from an account that has MFA than one that doesn't. And you also get a different response for locked accounts, but it doesn't tell you how long that account is locked for, unfortunately. Another thing I should mention actually on Azure is that they have a range of really good features for account protection, where they will highlight accounts that it thinks are at risk based on failed authentication events or the location where that user is logged in. And if you want to, you can very narrowly define when and where your users are allowed to log into for Azure. So, long answer for a simple question. Essentially, you can't tell is the short answer, but there are some ways that we can try and determine that. And as a defender, there are things you can do to prevent that kind of attack.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. And then just the last question that we've had in, it's just more relating to the training and courses itself, is there's a few classes for this course. There's 2-day, 3-day or 4-day courses.
Yeah.
I know what the difference is between them, if you know. Yeah,
so our 2-day course, I would say, really is focused towards those people that are very familiar with cloud environments. They may even have some security experience as well, and they just want to, as quickly as possible, get through the salient points. It's not their first rodeo, but our 4-day course is more focused to people who may have, zero security experience at all, and maybe even very little experience with the cloud other than maybe as a legitimate user inside of a couple of services. Gives us plenty of time to slow things right down, go into lots of detail, answer tons of questions, and give extra time for labs as well, and CTF. So with the 4-day content, we also add in a couple of new modules, which we've recently created, which is focusing on compromising Kubernetes environments and also Docker. So there is some new content in the 4-day, but the primary focus there is to give people lots more time to absorb things.
Great. Thank you very much. So that is all of the questions for today that we've had so far. So I'd just like to wrap up here. Say thank you again, Scott, for that presentation. Really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
And yeah, thank you, Roel, as well from the Netherlands. It was great to have you introduce the webinar in Dutch as well. It was really, really great. So yeah, thank you too. And yeah, thank you all for joining us today. I know we went a bit over. Yeah, make sure that you check out more of our prize draw and just use the contact details. We will be sending a recording of the webinar and presentation slides out to you tomorrow. If you missed anything in detail or want to find anything further on our website. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. So, bye everyone.